Welcome back. This is The Globe. 4 more people have died from Ebola in Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, just 2 weeks after another outbreak that killed 33 people in the northwest was declared over. The Congolese Health Ministry said the total death toll has reached 7 from 16 confirmed cases.
Health officials in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC, have said they will begin administering an experimental vaccine following a new Ebola outbreak last week. This outbreak is the second to strike the DRC in recent months and comes just 1 week after the Ministry of Health declared the end of a separate Ebola outbreak in Equator province. The Health Ministry on August 1st said the country was facing its 10th outbreak of Ebola since 1976. The World Health Organization, WHO, has said the deterioration of the security situation in affected areas was expected to hinder the response to the outbreak. Ebola causes serious illnesses, including vomiting, diarrhea, and in some cases, internal and external bleeding. It is often fatal if untreated. Targeted vaccinations are expected to begin on Wednesday. The east of the country has been affected by armed conflict for 2 decades. In the past 2 years, humanitarian organizations have not been able to safely access some parts of this area.
Borrie La Grange is the head of communications at the Doctors Without Borders Southern Africa and he joins me now in studio. Very good evening to you, Borrie. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome to The Globe.
Thanks for having us.
Now, first of all, this outbreak is the second to strike the DRC in recent months. Why is the DRC so prone to Ebola?
So I think we need to kind of look at things in historical context here. So this is the 10th outbreak in the DRC over probably about a 30-year period. So many of these outbreaks have been occurring in isolated areas and they normally affect roughly about 300 people or so. So what we know from previous outbreaks as well is that normally the survival rate is between 20 and 50%. So it's not very high. But what we can say is the most recent outbreak that was declared over last month on the 24th in Equator province, that only claimed the lives of 38 people. And there were quite a number of survivors. So we know that that survival rate is close to sort of 63%. So that's quite significant, and we know that the response to that initial outbreak was quite swift, and credit should go definitely to the Ministry of Health in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and also the WHO, which really stepped up to the plate in this instance.
And it's particularly worrisome because, as I've just mentioned, the latest incident comes just weeks after the government declared the Ebola epidemic over in the Equator province. Does the DRC have the capacity to contain this epidemic?
Well, I think we need to judge that capacity by what's there. So when you're dealing with an outbreak like this of a hemorrhagic fever that has no known cure, and essentially from a clinical perspective, we can manage the cases that are presented or that present themselves to treatment and isolation centers, and we can treat people's symptoms. But ultimately their immune systems should be able to fight the virus, and we're able to assist them in that sense. But because we're dealing with the DRC, it's a vast country. The healthcare infrastructure is limited as it is. So there are clear challenges in this regard. But when we look at this new outbreak in North Kivu, the good news in this case is that from Doctors Without Borders perspective is we were able to set up 2 treatment and isolation centers within the space of a week after being notified of this latest outbreak. And so the Ministry of Health is leading the response, and we have a particular role to play. Therefore, by training people to avoid the infection in health facilities, because we know that's from our previous experiences working in Ebola outbreaks, that's a very significant concern. And also to assist where we can in terms of the outreach activities to sensitize communities to the danger that Ebola poses.
Are we better prepared? I'm talking about the surrounding countries, the neighboring countries of the DRC. Are we better prepared to contain it, number one, and 2, to prevent it?
So at this stage, I think it's a bit too early to be very alarmed at this stage. So we need to see how this epidemic develops. It doesn't mean that the response is lagging at all. At this stage, from our perspective as Doctors Without Borders, we're prepared and we're running a treatment isolation center in Beni, which is a town of roughly 400,000 people. As you point out, what does this mean for the region? It's certainly of a concern. You have the border of Uganda, which is pretty close to this area of North Kivu. And so in this instance, I think it's also useful to consider that at this stage there's scant evidence to suggest that there's a link between this outbreak in North Kivu and the outbreak in Equateur province. Just the sheer size of the country and the distance between these two areas is roughly 2,000 kilometers. So for South African viewers, that's roughly the distance between Johannesburg and Cape Town. And what is though also something to note in this instance is that when you do have outbreaks of viral hemorrhagic fevers like Ebola in urban areas or close to urban areas, like the town of Beni with 400,000 people, that is of significant concern. So we can't really afford to keep our eye or to lose track of what's happening in the epidemic. And that's essentially why it's vital that the surveillance and outreach activities are conducted in an appropriate manner.
And I do understand that experimental vaccines are now facing real-life tests like heat, humidity, and access to those rural communities, especially in the remote areas. I mean, it's very, very difficult getting the vaccine from the laboratories to be injected into people. So is it fair to say that, I mean, the government, or particularly the health ministry, is now shooting in the dark?
I don't think that's a completely fair characterization of it. We need to look back at what was happening in Equateur province with the response. So in that instance, Doctors Without Borders participated with the Ministry of Health in doing what's called a ring vaccination with this trial vaccine. It's also important to know that there's no cure for Ebola, and neither is there a licensed vaccine that has been proven effective 100% or to such an extent there's very little unknown about it. So when the vaccination was conducted with the previous outbreak, Doctors Without Borders and the Ministry of Health succeeded in vaccinating roughly 3,000 people during that outbreak. And the prime objective with that was really to reach people who've had contact with known Ebola cases, but also to provide protection to health staff working in health facilities. If we recall the events of the 2014 and 2015 Ebola outbreak in West Africa, so in Liberia and Guinea and Sierra Leone, we know that healthcare workers were really at a huge level of risk as frontline workers in the response. And so the idea really with these ring vaccinations is to protect those who come in contact with the virus so that they don't themselves become infected and therefore deplete the numbers of healthcare professionals that are available to mount a credible response. So in this instance, when we talk about vaccination for this current outbreak in North Kivu, it's not sure yet whether that will be a viable strategy because there's still tests to be done to confirm the exact strain of the virus. Once that's known, then in the subsequent steps, there can be a determination whether a proactive vaccination with this trial vaccine is likely to yield some protection for healthcare workers and also people who've had contact with known Ebola cases.
And to this stage, I mean, the vaccines still haven't been licensed. Should we read too much into this? I mean, what's the reason for not licensing these vaccines and how much of an impact would it have on the fight against Ebola?
It would be brilliant if we had a vaccine that's been proven effective with a high level of confidence behind it. But that's essentially the situation where we are now is we're using this trial vaccine in instances where it's possible. But it's important that local health authorities, and in this instance the health authorities in the DRC, have review and ethics boards that determine whether these vaccines can be used at large scale. So it would be brilliant if we had a proven vaccine that can be used in all these instances, but we're still developing the evidence base to prove that that is in fact an effective and a trusted way. So time will have to tell. You mentioned some of the other constraints that we're facing generally as MSF or Doctors Without Borders, but more predominantly also other organizations that are doing routine vaccinations in very remote settings. If we look at the kind of vaccines that are available today, many of them have been developed by European manufacturers for European conditions. And we can agree that our conditions on our continent are not the same as in Europe. So if we have a vaccine that needs to be kept at a consistent temperature between 2 degrees Celsius and 8 degrees Celsius for the entire span of transporting it from when it arrives in a country to the point of, as you pointed out, being injected into a person, that vaccine needs to remain at that constant temperature. And so this is a huge logistical undertaking to ensure that that's possible. So you're looking at refrigeration to keep it at that temperature. You're also looking at large vaccination teams that have to be deployed. You're looking also at the efforts of people who are mobilizing communities to understand why vaccinations are occurring, that they should not fear, and that they should be able to get these vaccinations at certain points. So the logistics of it is quite a challenge. And when we're talking about a response in a place like North Kivu, which, as pointed out in the package just now, has seen over many years a high degree of instability and insecurity, this is of course also a concern of like how to roll out humanitarian activities in such a potentially volatile area.
If I heard it correctly, you just pointed out that some of these vaccines haven't been approved by authorities. I'm quite disturbed by that.
So what we know at this stage is the vaccine is a trial vaccine. So
like you're using an unapproved vaccine on human beings.
Well, I think here we need to caution a little bit. When we're talking about this trial vaccine, it is exactly the same vaccine that was used in Guinea during the previous large-scale outbreak. And there is no proven vaccine. And so in this instance, in order for science to build up an evidence base, so we can have clear scientific evidence and a high level of confidence in the efficacy of the vaccine, it is important that vaccination is done under strict controls and with the full acknowledgement and the requirements imposed on the use of that vaccine by local health authorities. So to say that it's not proven is perhaps not a very fair characterization of the situation. The Ministry of Health in the DRC would not allow us, neither their own staff, to deliver a vaccine if they didn't have a high degree of confidence that it's got some form of efficacy and that it is in these instances very likely that it'll have a positive outcome, at least in terms of mitigating the risks that frontline healthcare workers are exposed to. And we've seen already some evidence by using this vaccine to protect frontline healthcare workers and also people exposed to the virus because of their family contacts and the like in their communities in Guinea, and again now in DRC with this recent outbreak that was just declared over. So it's, I would caution us not to be alarmist about it, but look at it as an opportunity to gather significant scientific evidence that can prove useful in future responses. So we're really just at the beginning stages of this. So once this vaccine has gone through certain processes with assessing the efficacy of it, we may then have something that is considered to be a very vital tool that can be used in other outbreaks with a very high degree of confidence.
So if you use an unproven vaccine on a human being and it doesn't go according to plan, then a human being loses his life as a result of your experiment that did not go right. Is that correct?
Well, that could be a way of looking at it, but I think we need to kind of keep in mind the facts of the situation. We're dealing with a viral hemorrhagic fever that has no known cure, that has a survival rate, as I've mentioned, in the DRC of between 20 and 50%. So with the evidence that we have for this trial vaccine, and again I stressed it is a trial vaccine, this does offer a better shot at survival for people who are at high risk. So in this instance, this does mean that it offers more protection than you would have without.
Okay.
And people are not obliged to take the vaccine. If a person decides not to, they can refuse to do that.
All right.
But in a situation like this, it is probably one of the better options that we have in absence of having a cure or other known scientific treatments.
Okay. All right, Borrie, thank you so much for joining us. We have to leave it there.
For sure.
That was Borrie La Grange, who is the head of communications at Doctors Without Borders Southern Africa. He joins us in studio.